this is yet another episode of the Sober Atheist podcast. And this is John Huey. I am here with my co-host, Michael Tingley.
Hello.
And with a very special guest from Seattle, Washington, a gentleman by the name of Mark Dalton. And hello, Mark.
Hello.
And hello. And we're going to have a little bit of conversation today about long-term sobriety from the point of view of course, we tend to invite atheists, so we have a fellow atheist on the screen here with us. But we also have someone who, I should say parenthetically, I have known for nearly 58 years, which makes us old, okay? And I looked up the release date of the Velvet Underground's first album, and you must have had it the first week because it was released in March of 1967, and you showed it to me before April 1st of that year. So not only showed it to me, but turned me on to it. So Mark and I have known each other a very, very long time. And needless to say, we were both into the music. He was much more into real music, but I was into other kinds of music to a great extent for a very long period of time. But Mark got the message quite a few years before I did, and I'm going to have 38 years in January, and you coming up on how many years, Mark?
42.
42 years. So
I'm just a puppy at 19.
Mark's been around a very long time. He's a very well-known musician in the Seattle area and has been playing there for many, many, many years. So we're going to let Mark sort of take it away and, steer us in some sort of direction, which I think we have a general idea of. But I'll turn it over to Mark and try to keep my remarks blessedly brief.
Okay. Well, I was a musician when John and I met. I was a couple of years away from playing on a record that got some notoriety, at least, sold a lot of copies, and launched me, I guess, into a little wider range of musical endeavors. The thing about music and booze, I was primarily a blues musician, or I looked at myself as a blues musician. At the time, in the late 60s, with the Butterfield Blues Band and Eric Clapton and some other groups, there was a lot of interest in the blues. And growing up in the Midwest, where we had clear channel radio stations bombarding us from every direction, my friends and I got exposed to the blues pretty early on. Part of what we got exposed to was the mythology around booze, around alcohol, that, a lot of blues players were whiskey drinking crazy guys. And, growing up in a relatively small city in Nebraska, we sort of imagined ourselves as whiskey drinking crazy guys. And the fact that we got free beer at most of our gigs, and people were plying us with other kinds of drugs as well. We just really cruised along in an alcohol-fueled sort of way, which continued after I moved to Seattle. I got to Seattle in 1973 and promptly hooked up with Tom McFarland, who was an Irish-American blues shouter from the Portland area. And he was famous for his capacity to drink alcohol. And we got a gig downtown in Seattle 5 nights a week playing in a go-go bar that was owned by a local Italian-American businessman, let's say. And we had not only free beer at this place, but I could have any kind of drink I wanted. And I settled onto Black Russians. That was my drink. And I got up to where I could drink probably 4 Black Russians over the course of an evening without being so drunk I forgot where the changes were, and just continued on that way. Alcohol was readily available always to us, and this mythology that alcohol somehow would grant us a more soulful kind of existence than normal folks continued on. And when I started to get sober in 1983, one of the main tasks that I had was to disentangle myself from the mythology around alcohol and music. The idea of being a sober person and playing soulful music at first seemed like the two things didn't really go together very well. But I found through exploring the history of a lot of good musicians and through some advice from my distant musical mentor, which would be Muddy Waters, who told me in a song, "I ain't no hustler and I ain't no drunk." This was musical advice that I got from a record of his. But it was also, I read, advice that he gave his sidemen at times, including Junior Wells, who, the story goes, showed up drunk at a gig one night, and backstage Muddy Waters was slapping him across the face and saying, "Get yourself together, sober up. I don't have any drunks on stage with me." That kind of story stuck in my head. And I started going to meetings. There was a meeting across the street from where I was working up on Capitol Hill. I would go over there to the hospital cafeteria because the food was cheap there and it was pretty decent, eating with the nurses and doctors and stuff. And I walked past a bulletin board for months that had a sign up on it that said, "AA meeting Saturday, 1:30 p.m. And while I was still drinking, I stood in front of that announcement many times and thought, maybe I ought to check this out. Maybe I should look into this. And finally, I did. I went to a meeting Saturday afternoon, and I was scared to death. I thought my idea about Alcoholics Anonymous was that it was going to be like the Women's Christian Temperance Union or something, that I was going to go in there and everybody was going to go, "You're in trouble, buddy, but you're in the right place." And in fact, I walked into the room and an old guy stood up from a table where he was sitting, looked me right in the eye, stuck out his hand and said, "You're in the right place." But it wasn't scary at all. I walked in there and I could feel like a kind of a warmth and a lack of judgment in the room. And I went through several meetings without saying a thing. I just sat there and listened because I didn't know what to say, really. And then finally I started talking and learning how to talk to express some deeply held feelings, something that approached a sensible reality and into a group of people that I didn't really know personally. I started to get things a little more clear in my head. And so I just kept coming back. Now, the fact that I was not a believer going to Alcoholics Anonymous put me in a position where I really occasionally felt like I had to make a statement that my higher power was not some supernatural being, that my higher power at this present time was the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, not any kind of other belief system that I was holding that had anything to do with the Christian God or with getting on my knees or surrendering. And after a while, I found an ally that was coming to this home group of mine and later on ours, who worked for the Seattle Police Department, who shared a kind of rock bottom view of humanity that I had. I was working for the welfare department in the downtown Seattle office, which a lot of our clients were alcoholics. Some of them were like late stage on the street alcoholics. So every day I'd go to work and I'd see in front of me examples of what happened when you got to the point of being a late stage alcoholic, where you were coming into the welfare office and kind of throwing yourselves on the state's mercy just to get by for another week or so. You had no home, you had no money, you had no prospects of any sort of improvement in your life occurring on your own efforts. So I had this ally who also was an atheist. And so we would support each other when the guys came in and, announced that my higher power is Jesus Christ. And I get down on my knees, go to church every Sunday and talk to God whenever I need it. And that's what's keeping me sober. These people would come in and announce, and one or the other of us would say, they say Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious program, and the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. Now it says that, and I know, there's pressure, there's the chapter to the agnostic, there's, you feel this kind of inherent pressure to connect, that you're an agnostic now, but after a while, after you've been going to meetings and you see these massive improvements in your life, that you're going to get the message, that God's going to reach down and pat you on the head and say, I've been here all along. Well, no, whatever. People need to believe that. I guess it's okay with me, but they're not going to get me to believe it. So with that kind of support, having just at least one person there, and when we would push back when people were trying to turn our meeting, our home group meeting, into a religious revival, I managed to hang on and continue going to meetings and not feeling like an outcast or feeling like I was somehow deficient because I wasn't embracing the true God. But he's there. The Christian God is there in the pages of the big book in AA literature. That the program itself was founded by some strong religious ideas from Bill W. But it wasn't for me. It wasn't necessary to find that. So in Seattle at this time, there was one atheist agnostic meeting that I went to occasionally. There were a lot of musicians there, a lot of people in theater arts and stuff, a lot of wildly expressive people who had some great ideas, but the meeting occasionally bordered on a comedy routine because people were expressing their creativity in denouncing the religious aspects of AA. And, it was fun. Mm-hmm. There was another great meeting, the Fremont group, where I used to go and play at the Fremont Tavern, which was a rough and tumble biker bar. And it was right across the street from the Fremont AA hall, which was up some stairs on a second floor. And I'd go over there on our breaks. The band would take a break, and I had 15 minutes to walk across the street, walk up the stairs, and sit in on an AA meeting that was full of cranky old bikers and lots of four-letter words and stuff. And I'd get a cup of coffee in a styrofoam cup. And when I had to go back and get back on the bandstand, I'd bring my styrofoam cup in and put it up on my amp, just as my little testimony to the fact that, and people in the Fremont Tavern, a lot of them were also going back and forth across the street, not necessarily staying sober, but they certainly recognized the styrofoam cup that I was bringing back. And occasionally people would come up and talk to me about the fact that I appeared to be sober, playing in this absolute den of iniquity. The Fremont Tavern was just like rough and tumble. But I felt comfortable. And like I'd gone from being a representative of a drunken blues musician to kind of being a representative of the fact that you could be sober and you could play music expressively and it would all make sense, you know. And when I'd run into, well, actually, here's a good story. We were playing in a Harley Davidson dealership for many years down in Tacoma, and it would be a mixture of like these executive types in their brand new Harley Davidson and their squeaky clean leather jackets, and then the old one percenters would come there. You know, Gypsy Jokers in particular is a pretty large motorcycle club around here that's definitely 1%. And so one day there was the Gypsy Jokers were having a big poker run, they call them, and there was probably 50 of them came roaring into the parking lot at this dealership. And I got to talking to one of these guys, and he mentioned that he was in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I pulled out my coin and showed him my coin, and he pulled out his coin and showed me his coin. And he said, well, I bet about 50% of the members of my motorcycle club here are sober. And most of them got sober because they realized through whatever near misses that happened to them that if they kept on drinking, they better get off their bike and put it in the garage, or they could quit drinking and continue riding. And these guys are like hardcore motorcycle tramps, you know. They live to ride. And so he said about half of his club had gotten sober because they wanted to keep riding their bikes. And that made sense. Made sense to me because part of the reason I got sober was I wanted to continue playing my fucking bass. Excuse the language.
You could say whatever you want, Mark. Okay. We're not bashful here, so just let it rip.
Okay. All right. Well, so I mentioned I played on this record in 1969. And it was kind of a big deal for me. It was like knocked my head a little bit skewed to have a big hit at age 22. I was. But the best thing about that experience was my friend Friedemann Bender sent me a postcard from Africa. And he said on this postcard, I was riding on a ferry boat down the Congo River, and 2525, that's the name of the song I was on. 2525 was playing on the boat's radio. I thought, okay, if we made it that far, the Congo River in darkest Africa, I guess we did something. So that was fun. I really didn't talk much about that experience to anybody when I got to Seattle because, of course, it was such a big step outside of my personal image as a boozing blues guy. But nowadays, I'm comfortable. It's been a long process to kind of integrate myself. You know, I had this one persona as a state employee. I wound up as an office administrator, straight guy representing the interests of homeless people and stuff. And then I had this other continuing image as a musician, and blending all those things together has been the work of a lifetime for me. So that's my story to date.
And it's a story that's inspired me for a long, long time. Okay,
Thank you,
you were a very charismatic young man. Okay, and very you definitely knew the music that you liked and made no bones about what was good and what wasn't. And that was really, you knew a lot. Although your friends in Lincoln tended to play music very loud. I remember being in a room with you once with that first Butterfield album coming out of a couple of large, looked like Fender boxes in this room, and it was like, yeah, that was an experience. I got to feel Butterfield up close and personal. Long before I saw him years later, but I got to feel him in that room.
It said on the back of the album, "Turn this album up as loud as possible."
It still does. It still does. I got the I got the SACD version of it now. So yeah, it was. A lot of people in your world went down a very dangerous and bad and fatal road.
Yes.
And considering how far you were into it, and where you went, Kurt Cobain was not the first Seattle musician to bite the dust.
No.
Okay?
No.
So you're really a testament to like being fully immersed in a world for like 60 years or whatever it's been. You've been in that world, right?
Yeah.
And surviving it, not only intact but thriving. And then you mentioned though that you thrived within the context of that Alcoholics Anonymous thing, which I was a member of for a long, long time, but I never thrived in. All right. I mean, I was, you might remember me having a somewhat rebellious temperament. And, I just, I never just, it did. But, a lot of people are alive today because of that.
Yes.
That wouldn't be alive otherwise. So
right.
Who am I to, I can't make any bones about that. But as you well know, and you probably heard me say too many times, what I believe is that is a essentially passive aggressive outfit that deals in reinforcing negative opinions about yourself in order to exert a unreasonable amount of control on people's lives in order to get them to adhere to a dogma which they believe is the only way to proceed, right?
Right.
Yeah. So how did you rectify?
How did you deal with that shit?
Yeah. How did you rectify dealing with all that stuff?
That's just
I was fortunate in my choice of a home group, for one thing. The group met at Providence Hospital up here on Capitol Hill, and we started meeting in the doctor's lounge, which was like a beautiful room with French doors at each end of the room, cushy chairs, big round tables. And when I started showing up for meetings there, it was like early spring, and we opened up the French doors and the spring breezes were blowing through, and it was just like kind of a beautiful place to be. So I felt good about that right off the bat. The other thing was that it was a mixture of white folks, black folks, Native American folks, people from the neighborhood, which is a relatively affluent neighborhood, and then people from the streets, people from the black part of town. So it was like a real interesting mixture of cultures going on there. And I felt supported by the leader of our home group for many years was a guy from New Orleans who knew a lot about music, and we sort of bonded. I never had a sponsor per se, but I'd hang around after the meeting and help him put stuff away, and we'd just talk about things. And he had like a bluesman's sensibility, real accurate bottom line views of reality. Not a drunken kind of bluesman, but like real practical minded guy. And so I felt supported in that way. The other thing I have to say is that we didn't have any real alternatives in Seattle. There weren't any rational sobriety kind of groups. And I applaud you guys for presenting an alternative here. And I agree with a lot of what you say about Alcoholics Anonymous, while at the same time I have to remain grateful that what was available to me, and through the luck of the draw in my home group, which, because it was in a hospital, we got all kinds of people coming in and out of that group. There was a core group of maybe 10 or 12 people that showed up, every Saturday for the group. And then the rest of them would be oftentimes very interesting people who were just blowing through town, and had to find a meeting, and there it was. There was another group downtown at the YWCA that I went to because it was a noon hour group. I could walk up there from my office and spend my noon hour drinking coffee. And that was another interesting group. I remember the band Aerosmith came through town 20 years ago, maybe, or so. And the whole band was at that time trying to get sober. And so it was all the buzz in Seattle AA because Aerosmith was like showing up for meetings around town. One time I think she's gone now. I held hands with Faye Dunaway and said the Serenity Prayer at that downtown meeting because she was in town working on a movie and needed to have a meeting. So all of these things kind of helped reinforce in me the idea. But I also feel like my sobriety was actually a little stronger personally because I did have to stick up for myself and define my sobriety as the sobriety of an atheist. And but I was getting sober and staying sober through my own efforts to change the way I thought about things. And as I say, untangling this mythology and finding a new way of thinking about myself as not only being sober, but representing sobriety from a rational, non-theistic point of view. And I worked at that. Like I say, I never hesitated in saying, this is not a religious program. God is not my higher power, and I've never needed God to be my higher power because my higher power is people around me working on their own sobriety. So that's kind of how I did it. I just, I took advantage of what was available to me. Going to various meetings around Seattle that are so different in the way they're constructed and the way and the people that make them up was kind of an adventure for me when I first was getting sober, to just see the different kinds of folks. One meeting that I went to downtown was mostly lawyers, and these guys coming in with their $500 suits and stuff, and then talking about how miserable and fucked up their lives were as a result of their drinking, even though they were, making big money and doing important things. They got to the same place that I did, where it was either get sober or your life was going to fall apart underneath you.
It doesn't matter where you are in society.
No.
If you have what we have, life is shit. I used to go in my first years. I had a good friend up on the real Capitol. There's a Capitol Hill in Seattle, which is very well known, famous neighborhood, but the real Capitol Hill is someplace else. And I used to go to a meeting in the real Capitol in H310 inside the Capitol building every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. And my friend who I would call on, in those days I had to do some lobbying type stuff and I would be up there. My friend was an old politician who worked for a crooked congressman from California who I had to make calls on from time to time. And he and I, we would go up there, and you would not believe who was sitting in that room. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
senators, congressmen. But the guy that really turned my head around, and I apologize if I've told this story before, but it really blew my mind. One morning, I'm sitting in the second row. It was very hierarchical, all the sandy beach and all the fame. He was alive and he was there. And the famous guy, Hal Marley, Mr. Attitude of Gratitude, was sitting up on the dais. And then one of the senators was up there. And, the representatives were all in the front row and then on and on. It was sort of toward the back, but I was sitting in the second row one day and I'm looked over at this guy sitting next to me, and he mentioned something in his share, and I put it together that he was the son of the greatest media fortune in the United States. His father was the founder of a certain television network that owned a record company that one of our favorite musicians worked for. Columbia Records, but that was just one of his enterprises. And this guy was sitting next to me, and he was the son. And his mom and dad, I guess, were dead, but they were dead by then. But he had a house in Georgetown, and part of the art collection, and just part of it, whatever, And he was a guy. I looked over at him, and I said, if this guy could buy his way out of this, he would buy a hospital in Switzerland and just go there and turn himself over to the Swiss it all would be well. And there he is complaining about the same bullshit I am. All right. Okay. It didn't matter. It didn't make any personal circumstance, didn't make any difference. And from that point of view, that organization can be wonderful because it sort of levels things out. Mike Deaver, when he was alive, used to be sitting next to me in an AA meeting. And some years before, he'd been riding around in the limousine with Nancy Reagan, okay, and her wonderful senile husband, and the people like that sitting there who had completely destroyed their lives and crashed everything, Wilbur Mills, the famous Wilbur Mills. She was only a stripper from the Silver Slipper, but she sure had her ways and means. Because his stripper girlfriend jumped out of his limo one night and went into the tidal basin, and they were all arrested for being drunk. And there's fucking Wilbur sitting. Okay, all these Washington ne'er-do-wells, and I'm just a fucking X-ray salesman with a little office at 23rd and M, and we're all the same. All right, so that's cool. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But the unfortunate fact is, even in the most privileged environments, which I grew up in and was more not, from a middle class point of view, we were all sort of, privileged to have, families that weren't broken and, 3 hots and a cot and, somebody to pay college tuition and, stuff like that. Right. So, but no matter, and most of the people, a lot of the people I went to meetings here in Washington came from much more rarefied backgrounds than I did, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was a distressing part even there, that no matter how well educated, how well put together, how thoughtful some of these people were, they felt that they needed to adhere to a party line. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to adhere to a party line, I would have become a communist, okay? And tried to do some good in society, right? Mm-hmm. And believe and swear to, Papa Lenin and, and sign. No, I wasn't joining the Communist Party, and I wasn't going to join up in their little club. And that's a big problem, Mark, because that shit is very destructive to some people. Yep. So I know that it's wonderful and that it's a welcome, it's a helping hand. I hear It's wonderful to have a helping hand. But if the helping hand demands uniformity, that's an issue.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
you're a guy that's lived totally on his own. Of all the people I know, and you're one of the people that lives more on his own terms than just about anybody.
Wow, back at you. You know, when I
Well,
first met you, you were just as cranky and opinionated as you are today. And
thank you. At age 20, 18, 19, right?
the fact that you got sober is a source of continuing delight to me, as well
Thank
as my own sobriety. And here we are. You know, you're doing great work, both of you guys, presenting an alternative that you don't have to bend the knee to get sober.
right. But even in our sober world, right, that we have in the so-called secular world,
Yeah,
there's still the perception that the be-all and end-all is that organization, and that you have to somehow accommodate with or be within the envelope or context of
yeah,
that organization.
right. We have some alternative 12 steps for you.
Yeah,
It's like,
it's like, yeah, here's the King James Bible that I have annotated in a secular way. Okay. All right.
yeah,
It's, I've got a copy of it, the best copy, the one the Jesuits gave me when I went to graduate school. It's amazing. That's a dirty story. The Jesuits like the King James Bible more than the Vulgate. Don't tell anybody. They think it's literature and that the Vulgate sucks. But you know, what are we talking about here? Okay. And you managed to transcend the whole deal, it seems, Mark. I don't know. You mentioned that you don't really have that much to do with organized meetings and stuff like that anymore.
not anymore. Our home group kind of fizzled during the pandemic and never really got back together again. And I'm just cruising along. I guess I've got 41 years of momentum behind me, and I don't think about drinking anymore. If I do, I think about it in terms of being poisoned, like alcohol would poison my life, like
Oh, yeah.
pretty
Well,
fast, so it just keeps me going.
not to mention shorten it. Okay.
Yes,
I mean, that
absolutely.
would be like, a catastrophic. But, Michael's got a great story too. He came out of some hard Scrabble times. You
Let's
didn't
hear it.
always live in Indiana, did you,
Well,
Mike?
yeah, I've always been an artist, and I was an artist living in New York City, and it was the same thing, like you thinking that you couldn't be a proper blues player unless you were shit faced, and struggling with alcohol as an artist. I mean, I just assumed from day one that I was supposed to get shit faced and piss in Peggy Guggenheim's fireplace. I mean, that's just the way I was supposed to be. And I never questioned it. It was like, okay, and then having been to Woodstock, it was like, well, I have to be stoned on something all the time to do to be a real artist,
Right. Yeah.
and that was the biggest problem for me. I mean, I had a hard time facing sobriety, thinking, well, I can't really do anything. I can't really be creative sober, and that was a big hurdle to overcome. It took me quite a while, to come around to realizing that, well, wait a minute, because I didn't really have a lot of examples. I didn't have a lot of positive examples of people doing that. Like you said, Muddy Waters. I mean, I didn't have an artist example saying, don't show up at the gallery shit faced. I mean, I had art dealers who who enabled me. I mean, they would provide the alcohol, they would provide the cocaine, they would, I mean, it was just automatic. It was part of that whole culture,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then sobriety. I mean, especially getting sober out here in Indiana, I didn't have any positive experience with AA like that. I mean, there was no such thing as atheist or agnostic here, and I had to just filter out all that stuff, and
Yeah.
that became such a challenge to filter it out. Because there really wasn't anybody, and really not until the pandemic, when I discovered this whole secular world and the Zoom world of recovery, did I finally find some examples, some positive examples of how to stay sober without all that 12-step religious stuff. I mean, I really envy your story. I mean, and you're setting such a good example. That's the kind of thing that more people should hear. I was just talking to a young kid at a meeting this past Monday, a Zoom meeting, who asked me point blank. He said, "Well, how do you work the steps? What do you do? Have you worked the steps?" And I had to back away and say, I know you're trying to get sober and play along with the game that is presented to you, this AA program, but I don't buy it. And that's a tricky place to be, to tell a newcomer that you don't have to do it that way, because I mean, really, what is the alternative? Like you have, the internal strength and the motivation, partially based on having some positive examples of other people doing it the right way.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough place to be with a newcomer in particular.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
And your story is exactly what the newcomer should hear. And I wish it was out there a lot more than it is. But
Okay.
man, I appreciate what everything you've said, and yes, I will recommend that these newcomers that I run into listen to your story, because it's a positive way to go.
You not only get to be alive, but you get to be a happy older person doing what delights you, okay? And you're not dead, okay? It's
Not
really very cool,
Yeah.
but you can't do it you don't have to do it through deluding yourself
Yeah.
for 42 years or whatever.
I can't imagine what it would have been like trying to get sober in Nebraska, where I'm from, for example. I think in Nebraska, probably the balance is tipped way towards you got to have God in your life in order to get and stay sober.
Mm-hmm.
In Seattle, it was a little easier than that. As far as the steps go, when people ask me about the steps, I say I work one step. Step 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when I was wrong, promptly admitted it.
There you go.
That's the step that I adhere to.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just like keeping track of your life and where you're going. And, that's the one that makes sense. I never worked a fourth step. I didn't do any of the other steps. I looked at them and I thought about them, but I never worked the steps. I never sat down with somebody and confessed my sins to them. As far as making amends to people, sometimes if I needed to apologize for somebody for some past behavior of mine, I would do that. But it wasn't because Alcoholics Anonymous told me I had to do it. It was because I had some sense in my own heart that, I caused this person some pain.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tell him I was sorry that I did that it was, my behavior was stupid. And going back over my drinking years, it helped me to kind of pinpoint the stupidity, the depths of stupidity and self-centeredness, and that I went through. But it was as much due to just thinking about stuff, reading about stuff, There's this guy, Albert Ellis. Pretty early in my sobriety, I went to this guy, a PhD guy who was a rational therapist who like emphasized taking a look at what you're doing and sorting out what the reality of the situation was from the way that you feel about it. That was Albert Ellis's whole thing. It's like this 3-step thing. What you're doing, what's really going on, and how you feel about it, and then emphasizing that what's actually happening in your life is what's important, not necessarily your emotional response to it, because a lot of times, you're led astray. So that was helpful to me also.
Yeah. If you don't make rational decisions about what's really going on, you're going to totally lose your way.
Yeah.
I once encountered something sort of remarkable in William Faulkner's house in Oxford, Mississippi. In the years I was in the process of drinking my way out of graduate school, out of a perfectly good program at Georgetown, and was in the middle of the throes of my relationship with the lady that became wife number one. A lot of chaos going on in my life, but I went down there for a program and was studying with this group in this Faulkner program that I was at this University of Mississippi in the summer of 1975, I think it was. And I'm standing in Faulkner's study, and on the wall in front of his desk, it's a very small room. You would think he was a Nobel Prize winner and was probably the greatest recognized novelist, not the richest, but the greatest of his time in America. But he's in this tiny room, and they still had one of his old bottles of Old Granddad in there.
Mm-hmm.
And a desiccated Old Granddad bottle. And he wrote some magnificent books, but one of his last books was an awful thing called The Fable. It's crap, okay? And he was so fucked up when he was writing A Fable, he couldn't keep track of the plot or the chapters. And he wrote by hand on the wall all the, like little snippets of where he should be through the whole thing. And that wall was shellacked. I remember when it was on a like drywall, and they shellacked it and kept it up there. And here's the greatest man of his time, not able to focus on what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And not 5 years later, at age 62, dying in a shitty drying out place in Holly Springs, Mississippi, a shitty drying out place where he had his fatal heart attack in age 62. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And here we sit in our 70s, nowhere near, none of us are at the stature of a William Faulkner, but fuck, we're better off. Okay.
Yeah.
Like lots better off. I mean,
Better
Michael is one hell of a lot better off than Jackson Pollock. And, you are a hell of a lot better off than Michael Bloomfield. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're one hell of a lot better off than Bloomfield, or Butter for that matter.
Yeah.
And I'm doing better than my poetic mentor, Hart Crane, who got drunk and jumped off the back of a freighter at age 34 when he looked 60. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Because he'd been messing around with the wrong sailor in the engine room or something, and, it's just crazy shit. All right. Our lives are going to end, but they're not going to end that way. All right.
No.
And but they're also not going to end with a brain full of shit delusion about what the world is. Nobody sold us that, and we didn't buy it.
Mhm.
Well, they sold it to us, you know,
Yeah.
right? We weren't buying.
Yeah.
They were selling, but we weren't buying. You know, it's like and the people in those clubs in the old days, they tried to sell you all kinds of shit. I bet, Mark. Like,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, oh yeah, yeah. So we're like doing good, but I'm still a little perplexed about people that can accommodate with conventional AA fully over long periods of time. Because, as I've said many times, if it weren't for the two atheists that founded the atheist agnostic meeting here in Washington in '88, I'd be pushing up daisies. I wouldn't have made it. I would I would literally have rather been dead than be one of them. Okay, I mean I'm sort of bloody minded. Okay, I would, if somebody hadn't presented me with a rational alternative, you
Uh-huh.
know, like that, Jack Daniels and Wild Turkey and Heineken, you know, really look better than that, right?
Right.
And I'm not the only one like that. There's lots of people like that, and unfortunately, in our world, there are a lot of people that sail out to die unnecessarily
Yeah.
because they don't see the alternative that you saw, Mark, or Michael saw, or I saw. Shit, that's
Mhm.
kind of tough, man.
Yeah.
So we're
We're,
trying to
we're,
save a couple of them. What?
we're fortunate.
We're fortunate. Well,
Very.
we're
And
fortunate.
one of the saddest things that I've seen in recent years was several of my friends died from hepatitis C,
Mm.
um, the silent killer they called it, and it was the reason they died from hepatitis C was based on their behavior like 15 or 20 years ago. These were people that had been snorting cocaine through $20 bills. I was guilty of that on occasion. People that, had shot some dope at some point in their life, but, had been clean for extended periods of time. And hepatitis C was come sneaking up on them decades later and killed them. Nowadays there's treatment for Hep C, but that's
Yeah.
only been recently. I work with a drummer who had Hep C, who was salvaged because they figured out a treatment for it, and he got over it. But several of my other friends didn't happen.
I'm one of those. I escaped New York in '92
Mm-hmm.
when all of my friends were dying of AIDS and all kinds of things. I escaped only with hepatitis C.
Uh,
I was fortunate that that's all I got away with.
well,
And yeah, I had to go through the cure. I guess it's been almost 10 years now.
uh,
But yeah, it was pretty scary. And all the doctors out here just assumed that I had AIDS. They kept testing me and testing me and testing me. And then they finally realized, nobody knew what it was for a long time.
yeah.
But yeah,
So,
I was fortunate to have been caught in time and it didn't do as much damage as I could have,
I'm
and
sorry to hear that.
that's also one of the motivators for my sobriety. You know, I, when the doctor told me that I had hepatitis C, he drew a little chart. He said, one drink is one too many. Is too many. He said,
Yeah.
if you drink, you're going to die. Well, I kept drinking for 7 years. Because I just said, well, that doesn't really apply to me. No, I'm just gonna, no, I just didn't hear it. I didn't hear it. I
Uh,
mean, that's one reminder for me of how crazy alcohol made me. I refused to accept that. For 7 years. I kept drinking, thinking that no, it doesn't apply to me, only because I did not want to stop. There's no way, and there's no way I'm going to live without drinking. But and when the opposite was true, I was going to die. Yeah, so it's a good reminder for me just how far you go when you're addicted to that stuff. You know,
Well,
there's no rational thought. You know, I mean,
well, there's a lot of mysterious stuff going on with how people approach their addiction and their alcoholism.
man,
And
it's scary.
it
It's scary.
often has very little to do with rational process.
Whew.
And there's a lot of mystery about who makes it and who doesn't, right? So that's why I'm been laboring in the back of my mind, and you'll see an episode somewhere down the road, not too far from now, about atheism, sobriety, and mystery, because an atheist has to approach the mysterious elements of this as well. And how do we do that without incorporating any elements that involve fantasy?
Yeah,
A great idea.
It's an idea because we don't get sober many times in a perfectly rational way. But there's always that moment of clarity at the end that gets us there, right? And that's mysterious, right? Because that's real quick in the dead kind of shit, you know? Like who makes it and who doesn't. It's a little bit like who has a hit record and who doesn't, you know? There's a lot of mystery about that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Or who gets the parking space at the meeting? You know, I've heard that so many times.
They love that shit. They love that
it's
shit.
It's a God thing, man. It's a God thing, you know.
Yeah, they love that shit. Or, you know,
I don't understand why you have to have an explanation. Why not just accept the mystery? I mean,
you know,
like,
if you pray hard enough, your brain
amazing.
tumor will go away. Okay, you know, they got all kinds of shit going on that just doesn't make any sense at all. But I think maybe did we make some sense this evening? I think
I appreciate your example, Mark. I appreciate hearing how you did it, and
not the least of which is his over 50 years of marriage. That's something I find really almost inconceivable.
Well, there's
considering my history.
There's definitely some mystery there, John.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's like she's like amazing woman.
Yeah, there's no mystery why I don't have 50 years of marriage.
Well, there's no mystery why I was 57 years old before I solved that particular problem. So, you know, but I did solve it. So there we go. So, you know, we're all very fortunate. And I think we might have a few disagreements about the finer points, but I think the basics are pretty well established. All right.
Yeah.
We do this using reality, not fantasy, and with a word that Michael likes to use often at the end of our podcast.
Hope. We have hope, man.
We have hope. We have hope. And that's an essential
and it's because
element.
of you, man. I feel a strong sense of hope right now because of what you've just said.
Yeah,
so, good stuff, man.
You know, and we don't do it in a vacuum. Okay, we do it in conjunction with others.
Yeah,
but without assuming any ridiculous notions that someone's trying to sell us that are not real. All right.
Yep.
So that all works too, and leads us to the penultimate moment in our podcast where we wish everybody a pleasant good night. And we talk about, what do we say at the end? We say
peace and love.
Peace and love.